Humans forbidden from taking part in wars. Lawmore rose from his seat, his golden eyes drilling into Maurer before shifting to address his fellow officer candidates of the Royal Armada. This can't be right. It's absurd. You're telling us that in a galactic council with hundreds of species, a single race is banned from waging war, and we're just supposed to accept this as fact. He scoffed, his disbelief evident. This has to be some kind of test. There's no way this lecture is serious, he added, crossing his arms. Maurer observed from his slightly elevated platform as Lawmore and the other two captains in training stared at him, their skepticism as dense as cosmic mist in the Academy's smallest lecture hall. The Larian who had spoken remained standing, his violet tinge bristling along his shoulders, golden eyes narrowing into slits of disdain. Maurer studied Lawmore carefully, noting the way the young Larian's long, pointed ears angled toward him, like weapons locking onto a target. His sleek, muscular tail flicked behind him, a rhythmic countdown of his dwindling patience. His lean, powerful frame, characteristic of their feline species, was coiled with tension, the same kind Maurer had seen in himself during his youth. Lawmore's clawed fingertips tapped against the surface of his desk, each sharp click a subtle declaration of defiance. Maurer turned his gaze toward the other two students, his own violet-hued fur dull with the passage of countless cycles. Captain in Training Lara. Captain in Training RIR. Do you share Lawmore's doubts about today's lesson? The question, though unnecessary, was a formality. The dark stripes along his face had faded with age, leaving his Larian features locked in perpetual stern expression. His whiskers twitched slightly, the only outward sign of the amusement he felt at their predictable skepticism. With respect, Professor Maurer, Lara responded, straightening her slender frame. It defies all military logic. Her sleek fur, a lighter lavender shade than her male counterparts, stiffened slightly as she gestured with a clawed hand. If humans wanted to wage war, what physical force could possibly stop them? Laws are nothing more than artificial constructs. If they desired conflict, they would simply strike. Her golden eyes narrowed slightly, betraying the calculations running through her otherwise composed exterior. I must agree, added R, his voice cool and analytical despite the intensity in his amber gaze. Unlike Lawmore's passionate outburst, Rear's objection was wrapped in measured reasoning. The premise contradicts the core principles of sovereignty and deterrence theory. While Captain Lawmore's reaction may be fervent, he continued, pausing as his tail flicked once in subtle disapproval, his underlying argument aligns with established doctrines. No species relinquishes its military capabilities without overwhelming force compelling such submission. Maurer absorbed their responses, cataloging each reaction with the practiced eye of someone who had evaluated countless military minds. Lawmore, instinctive, passionate, quick to challenge, would make an excellent tactical commander, if he could temper his fire. Lara, methodical, direct, perceiving clear paths where others saw none, would be invaluable in a crisis. RIR, the intellectual, a strategist who saw patterns and connections, was dangerous in his quiet way. All three brilliantly trained. All three utterly ignorant of true horror. Maurer felt a familiar weight in his chest. The memory of plasma fire raining down on Sector 9, of the human warship that had materialized from nowhere after his squadron, had cornered what they believed was a defenseless human transport. Even now, 3 centuries later, he could still hear the screams of his comrades. He could still remember why the galaxy now paid humanity any price to remain peaceful. He took 3 slow steps across the polished obsidian of his teaching platform, the ancient service medals on his uniform reflecting the cold light. "You are all correct in theory," he said. His voice carried the weight of someone who had witnessed firsthand what happened when theory shattered against reality. No species should accept such restrictions. No law alone can force it. Then this entire lesson is flawed, Lawmore interjected, sinking back into a seat with a triumphant flick of his tail. Don't rush to conclusions. Maurer turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the 3 students seated in a semicircle before him. The chamber was small by Academy standards, designed for specialized instruction rather than general lectures. I said no law alone can force it. But what if I told you humans are compensated? Lara's ears perked forward, an instinctive response she quickly suppressed. Compensated for not waging war. Her voice remained steady, but the carved stone bench beneath her creaked as she leaned in slightly. Precisely. Mara reached into his worn service jacket and retrieved a folded document, brittle with age. He carefully unfurled it and turned it toward them. These are the annual tributes, though we don't officially call them that, provided to human colonies and their central government. Rear's amber eyes widened as he scanned the figures. His tail, usually kept perfectly still, twitched once. This can't be correct. These amounts would bankrupt multiple sectors. And yet, every cycle we pay. Maurer's tone hardened. The council determined it was cheaper than the alternative. What alternative? Lamore asked, his earlier defiance waning beneath growing unease. Maurer stepped to the edge of his platform, looking down at his students from a mere 30-centimeter elevation that now felt like a mountain between their experience and his. The alternative, he said slowly, is rebuilding after human wars, counting our dead, being remembered only in memorial archives. A heavy silence filled the room. The air circulation system hummed in the background. The only sound as the three students exchanged uncertain glances. You believe humans are that dangerous? Lara said, not a question, but an attempt to reconcile the absurdity of what they were hearing with the unwavering seriousness of their professor. I don't believe it, Ma replied, his eyes distant. I survived it. I know they are. He studied them one by one before continuing. The question isn't whether humans are dangerous. The question is why they are forbidden from fighting our wars. He let the moment linger before delivering the final blow. And the answer is simple. Humans don't fight wars the way we do. Maurer's gaze locked onto each of them in turn. They don't have natural weapons like our claws. They lack instinctive hunting behaviors. They had to invent every aspect of warfare from the ground up. He leaned forward, his voice quiet but razor-sharp. And when a species has to invent killing instead of evolving with it, they approach it differently. Silence pressed down like a physical weight as Maurer's words sank in. Lamore shifted in his seat, his earlier defiant posture returning. But before he could speak, Maurer raised a weathered hand. Before any of you unleash your sharp-witted arguments, he said, his tone dipping into something darker, let me tell you a story. He stepped down from his platform, an unprecedented break from Academy protocol, and stood directly before them. 3 centuries ago, I wasn't Professor Maurer. I was Cadet Maurer, fresh from this very academy, assigned to the Size campaign. And with that, the real lesson began. They spoke of a catastrophic population decline, but never explained why. M nodded grimly. History is written carefully when the lessons are uncomfortable. He continued without further acknowledgement of her comment. The Cathy plan was simple. Seize Earth's moon, humanity's oldest and most symbolically important colony. Not to keep it, but to demonstrate that humans were not beyond the Council's reach. To teach them that defiance had consequences. He began to pace slowly, his footsteps matching the cadence of his words. My ship took position in the shadow of Mars, close enough to observe, yet beyond detection range. The Cathy arrived with their usual arrogance. 47 battleships, each carrying thousands of warriors, emerging from hyperspace in perfect formation. And then, they did something no species would consider wise. Size molar paused, his ears flattening. They announced their intentions. From the moment they entered real space, they broadcast on all frequencies. Asterisk reclaimed this moon for the Karai Empire as punishment for human transgressions against Galactic Law. Evacuate or be removed. Asterisk. R's analytical mind engaged immediately. They warned them after what happened at Size. Arrogance, and replied simply. The Karai had never lost a military engagement in 2,000 years. They wanted humans to know who was coming and why. They expected fear, perhaps negotiation. They received neither. His voice took on a clinical detachment, as though reciting a field report. The initial phase proceeded as expected. Karai forces overwhelmed the lunar defenses within hours. Their neural-link battle coordination was magnificent, even from our observation position. Human defensive platforms were disabled one after the other. Their patrol ships were driven back to Earth orbit. By all tactical assessments, the operation was flawless. M's eyes narrowed. Then, something changed. Sensors detected massive ships launching from Earth, not from military installations, but from civilian power facilities, manufacturing centers, even residential sectors. Every human nation, entities that had fought one another viciously for centuries, suddenly coordinated their response. They united. Lamore asked, his earlier skepticism gone. As I told my first officer at the time, trust me, that was no small thing. M's voice was measured. Their historical records show endless conflicts between their nation-states. Yet faced with the Cathy, ancient enemies pooled resources, shared technology, and combined their forces under a single command. His pace quickened. The battle that followed defied all strategic models. Human ships, smaller, less armored, seemingly outmatched, began employing tactics that violated every principle of space warfare. They sacrificed vessels to draw Cathy forces into specific configurations. They used their own damaged ships as weapons. When the Cathy adapted, the humans shifted their approach instantly. His normally controlled voice grew animated. For 6 days, we watched the conflict escalate. The space between Earth and its moon became a graveyard of ships from both sides. For the first time in their history, the Cathy found themselves in a battle they could not decisively win. Their neural network, so effective in domination, became overwhelmed with defensive calculations. He stopped pacing and looked directly at his students. On the 7th day, the Cathy Supreme Commander made a fatal miscalculation. With 30% of their fleet destroyed and no clear path to victory, they decided the lesson had been delivered. They began withdrawing in a coordinated retreat. Sizemoller's voice dropped to a near whisper. To the Cathy, it was a strategic redeployment. To the humans, it was an opportunity. They did not pursue immediately, not directly. Instead, they allowed the first withdrawal waves to escape, while positioning their forces along the likely retreat vectors. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a hunt. The Cathy, bound by their rigid command structure, couldn't adapt. Their careful withdrawal became a desperate retreat, then a rout. Surely, they surrendered when defeat became inevitable? Our IR suggested. M gave him a look that silenced further comment. The Cathy had never surrendered in their history. Their genetic and cultural programming didn't allow for it. And the humans, after so much destruction, there was no middle ground. The Cathy had come to their home, threatened their oldest colony, and killed thousands. To humans, this wasn't about territory. It was existential. His tail had gone completely still, a sign of deep discomfort among Larians. The pursuit lasted for months. Humans followed retreating Cathy vessels to their staging areas, then their outer colonies, and finally, to their home world. At every point, the Cathy expected the humans to declare victory and withdraw. At every point, they were wrong. M's voice was hollow. When it ended, the Cathy civilization, once the dominant military force of the galaxy, was reduced to a protected species on a single reservation world. Their population fell from billions to fewer than 6 million. The classroom fell into complete silence. To this day, no one knows if their near extinction was due to their refusal to surrender or the human willingness to carry out extended campaigns. What is clear is that what began as a lesson for humans became a lesson for the rest of the galaxy. M finally stepped back onto his platform, reclaiming his professorial demeanor. Is that why humans were forbidden from joining wars? M.O. asked. The Cathy incident should have been enough. Yet it wasn't. Lamore, who had begun the class with defiance, now leaned forward, engrossed. Then what happened? Professor Lara's serious gaze softened into curiosity. Why are the historical records vague about the events leading to the Human Exemption Treaty? Even Ramir's tail betrayed anticipation, swishing gently against his chair. If 2 events of this magnitude weren't enough to convince the Council, what could humans possibly have done to secure such an unprecedented legal status? Maurer studied his students, the future captains of the Royal Armada. Their earlier skepticism had transformed into a hunger to understand. That, he said, settling into his chair, brings us to the Proxima incident. And unlike the previous events, he had not been an observer. He had been at the very center of a decision that would forever change how the galaxy approached humanity. The room fell into a heavy silence as M's words settled over his students. His claws traced absent patterns on the desk, his tail unnaturally still, a Larian sign of deep unease. "They weaponize fear," he continued, his voice quieter now, more measured. "A governor who advocated strong anti-human policies would find a small human device placed in their private chambers, not active, not armed. Just there, a reminder that nowhere was safe." The students exchanged uneasy glances. The implications were chilling. High-ranking officials disappeared without a trace. Shipyards suffered unexplained failures. Entire fleets lost contact, their last transmissions little more than static-laced confusion. He exhaled sharply. They didn't fight us conventionally, because they didn't have to. Every strategic principle we relied upon, they dismantled with ruthless efficiency. Rear's voice was subdued. "And the council?" M's ears flicked back, paralyzed by indecision. Every proposed retaliation was met with another devastating, precise human response. They would sabotage, infiltrate, and disrupt not just military targets, but the very infrastructure of governance. His eyes darkened as he leaned forward. I remember the moment it truly shifted. A high counselor, one of the most powerful in the galaxy, was found adrift in his private vessel, unharmed, but with every system disabled. The only functioning device was a simple screen displaying a single human phrase: "Cease your pursuit or we escalate." A chill settled over the classroom. They had no centralized command, no home world, no standing army that could be confronted directly. And yet, in less than 5 years, the most powerful coalition ever assembled was falling apart. We were losing. Lawmore, who had begun the lesson with such skepticism, now spoke hesitantly. "So, what happened?" M's gaze grew distant. "Proxima." Silence stretched between them before he continued, his voice laden with something heavier than mere memory. "By then, we had lost entire sectors to their relentless attrition tactics. The Council, desperate for a decisive strike, ordered an overwhelming force to a system they believed housed one of humanity's last major operational bases, Proxima Centauri." His grip tightened on the edge of his desk. "I led that fleet." A slow inhale, a measured exhale. "We expected battle. Instead, we found nothing. No defenses. No resistance. Just an automated transmission." He looked each of them in the eye before speaking the words he would never forget. "Your war is over. Leave, or you will not have a home to return to." Laura whispered. They would. M cut in, his voice edged with something raw. "And we believed them. After everything we had witnessed, after every unthinkable tactic they had already deployed, we knew, if we continued, they would make good on their warning." He let the weight of that truth settle before concluding, "And that is why the Galactic Council signed the Human Exemption Treaty. Not because they pitted humanity, not because they forgave them, but because they feared what would happen if we pushed them any further." The room was silent. Finally, our IR spoke, his voice almost reverent. "So that's why humans are forbidden from joining wars." M nodded slowly. The galaxy realized too late that nothing good ever comes from fighting humans.